The newspaper printed it. That is where this story begins. Not with a rumor, not with a legend passed between farmers over fence lines, but with ink on paper, columns set in type, a dateline out of Wisconsin, and an editor who apparently saw no reason not to run it. A May 1912 dispatch in the New York Times, a report that can still be located in the archive today, carried an account specific enough to stop a reader cold. It described a crew of workers breaking ground near the northern shore of Lake Delavan and encountering something that halted the dig entirely. Not rock, not underground root structure. Bone. Human bone, by all appearance, but organized in a way that made the men stop and look at each other before anyone said a word. The account described remains whose dimensions, as recorded by the men who found them and the reporter who filed the story, fell well outside anything previously encountered in local excavations. And this was not one burial. The mound contained multiple sets of remains, arranged with the kind of deliberate structure that does not happen by accident, that does not happen in a field grave, that requires thought and precedent and population enough to bury its dead according to plan. The article ran. Readers across the country could have seen it the next morning with their coffee. And then, quietly, the story stopped. Not because it was refuted, not because the discovery was explained away in a follow-up column, not because a scientist came forward with a correction. It stopped because something else happened instead. Someone arrived at Lake Delavan with institutional authority, and the bones went with them. What followed was not a published analysis. What followed was silence, dressed as science. That is the shape of this story. Not a mystery buried for centuries. A discovery made in the open, reported in one of the country's largest newspapers, and then managed out of the public record by an institution whose stated purpose was, officially, to know better than anyone else what had been found. The official version of this event is not dramatic. It does not need to be, because its function is not drama. It is reassurance. The standard account goes something like this. Mound sites throughout Wisconsin and the broader Midwest were excavated throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries as part of the growing field of American archaeology. The Smithsonian Institution, as the nation's primary scientific body, oversaw or participated in many of these collections. Remains were gathered, classified, and stored. Some reports from this era were exaggerated. Some measurements were recorded imprecisely. The press, which was not scientifically literate and was frequently sensational, sometimes amplified minor finds into major claims. The skeletal remains described in that 1912 report were, in this reading, the product of journalistic enthusiasm and the natural human appetite for the extraordinary. Nothing anomalous was found. Everything was accounted for. The institution handled it. That version is clean, it is comfortable, and it has one very specific problem. The Smithsonian's own annual reports from the 1880s through the early 1900s document thousands of mound artifacts received from collection sites across the Midwest. Wisconsin appears in those reports repeatedly. The scale of the collection operation is not in dispute. But when researchers attempt to trace the specific accession records for the Delavan collection, what was received, what was cataloged, where it resides, they describe encountering incomplete documentation and redirections. Whether through formal information requests or archival visits, the paper trail after the point of collection becomes thin in ways that the Smithsonian's record-keeping standards of the era make difficult to explain as simple oversight. The Smithsonian did not deny that it came to Lake Delavan. It simply stopped producing documents after the moment of collection. And in an institution that kept meticulous records of tens of thousands of artifacts, that gap is not administrative sloppiness. Gaps in archives of this scale are decisions. The absence is itself the document. Step back for a moment, because before 1912, Someone else had already been paying careful attention to this lake. Increase Lapham was Wisconsin's first scientist in any meaningful sense of the term. He arrived in Milwaukee in 1836, began surveying the landscape with the kind of exhausting precision that most of his contemporaries reserved for profit margins and land deeds, and produced, by the 1850s, a detailed cartographic record of Wisconsin's mound systems that no one before him had attempted at this scale. His 1855 publication, The Antiquities of Wisconsin, submitted to the Smithsonian's own Contributions to Knowledge series, mapped the mound landscape of the state with a thoroughness that still commands attention. His maps of the Lake Delavan region show something that is easy to overlook if you read them quickly, and devastating if you read them carefully. The density of effigy and conical mounds around that lake is not consistent with casual or scattered burial practice. It is consistent with a population that had been using this landscape for a very long time, with architectural intention in patterns, geometric, animal form, directional, that require exactly the kind of organizational continuity that the official prehistory of the region tends to minimize or avoid. Lapham noted dimensions. He noted placements. He noted relationships between mound clusters that could not be explained by random accumulation. His field notes describe measurements and configurations that fall outside the expected range for the populations the official sequence assigns to this geography and this time period. He published. He submitted his findings to scientific societies. And then, for 60 years, nothing. No institutional follow-up. No funded research program targeting the anomalies he had identified. No expedition dispatched to determine what the mound density at Delavan might indicate about the depth and character of pre-Columbian civilization in the upper Midwest. 60 years of documented anomaly, sitting in the record, producing no institutional response. What changes everything is this, that silence is not ignorance. You do not ignore Lapham's maps by accident. You do not fail to follow up for 60 years because the anomaly slipped notice. You fail to follow up because the follow-up would produce a question the institution is not prepared to answer on the terms it has already publicly committed to. The 1912 excavation was not the first time Lake Delavan's mound system produced unexpected material. It was the first time the material was large enough, specific enough, and public enough to require active management rather than passive neglect. This is where the story stops being about a skeleton. The mounds around Lake Delavan are part of a regional system. Effigy mounds, built in the form of animals, birds, geometric shapes, appear across a specific corridor of the upper Midwest in densities that archaeologists acknowledge required sustained population and structured cultural continuity over centuries. The panther mounds, the bird mounds, the linear alignments. These are not improvised. They are deliberate impressions left on a landscape by people who understood that landscape as a record-keeping surface. What the 1912 find added to this picture was not simply anomalous remains. It was remains inside a mound system that was already, in the existing record, unexplained by the accepted settlement timeline. The material did not merely suggest individuals whose physical characteristics fell outside the local expectation. It suggested a population continuous enough, organized enough, and spatially sophisticated enough to have built the landscape that contained them. That is a very different kind of discovery than an oversized skeleton. That is evidence of a civilization the official American prehistory had not assigned to this place, this period, or this scale, which raises the question of why the Smithsonian's collection methodology, operating across decades and across dozens of sites, produced a single consistent result: remove the material, publish no anomalous finding, close the file. The Smithsonian's Division of Mound Exploration, conducted through the 1880s under Cyrus Thomas and the Bureau of American Ethnology, surveyed mound sites across the Midwest. By Thomas's own 1894 report, encompassing thousands of individual mounds. It employed field agents across the Midwest, the Southeast, and into the territory of the Great Plains. It produced enormous quantities of material, and from all of that material, it produced a narrative of American prehistory that remained, in its essential conclusions, remarkably stable. Mound builder civilizations were real, but were the ancestors of existing native populations, not a separate or anomalous group, and certainly not a population whose characteristics posed any challenge to the standard chronological account. Consider the pattern, not across one site, across dozens. A local press report describes a significant find. The institution arrives. The material is removed. No anomalous findings are published. Local press loses access or interest. The story narrows to a footnote. Lake Delavan in 1912 fits that pattern in every particular. When a methodology this consistent produces the same conclusion this reliably, across this many years and this many locations, it stops resembling a series of independent assessments. It starts resembling a system designed to process inconvenient evidence into institutional silence. The question is not whether the Smithsonian made mistakes. The question is whether a collection process that produced the same non-finding, nothing anomalous, nothing outside the accepted framework, across decades of mound excavation, represents scientific accuracy or represents something more structurally useful. Whether it reflects the honest limits of the evidence, or whether it reflects an institution that had already decided what the evidence was permitted to mean before the first field agent arrived at any of these sites. That question matters because the Smithsonian in this period was not simply a museum. It was the primary institutional authority on what American prehistory looked like. Its conclusions became the conclusions. Its silences became the silences. Its published record was the record that textbooks, federal legal frameworks, and Indian policy took as their scientific foundation. In 1912, while the institution was collecting from Lake Delavan, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, opened just 2 years earlier, in 1910, was in the active process of building out the exhibit halls that would define American prehistory for generations of visitors. The halls that would tell millions of American schoolchildren who was here before Columbus, in what numbers, at what level of organization, and with what relationship to the continent they had inhabited for millennia. The workers on the northern shore that morning reported what they found. The newspaper printed it without hesitation. The institution arrived. And then the evidence went somewhere it has not come back from. What was taken from Lake Delavan did not disappear into a basement. It disappeared into a decision about what America's past was allowed to look like. The Bureau of American Ethnology was not an accident of science. It was a creation of Congress, funded annually, answerable to the federal government, and staffed by men who understood that their work had implications well beyond the academic. When the Bureau dispatched agents to mound sites across the Midwest, it did so under the authority of a national institution whose conclusions carried legal and political weight. This was not a university department pursuing knowledge for its own sake. This was an arm of the federal apparatus, and the federal apparatus in 1912 had very specific needs when it came to the question of who had lived on this continent, for how long, at what level of sophistication, and with what claim to the land that had since been transferred by treaty, seizure, allotment, and sale into the hands of others. The Bureau of American Ethnology had been directed for more than 2 decades by John Wesley Powell, geologist, Civil War veteran, the man who led the first documented expedition through the Grand Canyon via the Colorado River in 1869, and the figure most responsible for shaping the institutional vocabulary of American prehistory in the late 19th century. Powell died in 1902, a decade before the events at Delavan. But the methodology he built did not die with him. The conclusions he had structured into the Bureau's operating logic outlasted him by years, maintained by the institutional machinery he had constructed and by the researchers who had built careers inside the framework he defined. Under Powell's direction, Cyrus Thomas led the Bureau's Division of Mound Exploration and published his landmark report in 1894, concluding that the mounds were built by the ancestors of existing native populations, not by a lost race, not by an anomalous civilization, not by any group whose characteristics fell outside what the accepted framework could absorb. The Bureau produced systematic debunking of any claim that suggested otherwise, and that institutional posture remained in place long after Powell was gone. What makes that position structurally interesting is not that it was wrong. It may have been partly right. What makes it structurally interesting is that it was produced by the same institution that was simultaneously collecting the physical evidence that might have tested it. The Bureau debunked publicly, it collected privately, and it controlled the archive that would have allowed any independent researcher to verify which conclusion the actual material supported. Debunk publicly, collect privately, control the archive. That is not a scientific methodology. That is information management. And it operated across decades, across administrations, across dozens of sites, with a consistency that casual institutional failure cannot explain. Now hold that picture and place it next to what was happening in federal Indian policy during exactly this period. The Dawes Act became law in 1887. Its mechanism was allotment, the division of communally held tribal land into individual parcels, with the surplus, and there was always surplus engineered into the process, transferred to federal control and then open to white settlement. The Dawes Act required a legal and cultural rationale. It required a story about the people whose land was being parceled and transferred. And the story it required was specific, that native populations were primitive, transient, without the kind of complex civilization that would support a territorial claim legible to American law. A prehistory full of organized mound builders, sophisticated, capable of architectural projects that rivaled anything the European archaeological imagination had assigned to the pre-Columbian world, was a problem for that story. Every burial mound that demonstrated intentional design was a complication. Every set of remains that fell outside the expected parameters was an evidentiary inconvenience. Not because any individual disproved the Dawes Act in a courtroom, but because the aggregate picture, if allowed to accumulate in the public record unchallenged, would have made the foundational assumption of allotment policy that these were simple people with simple claims to a landscape they barely organized, considerably harder to sustain. The removal of physical evidence from sites like Lake Delavan was not parallel to federal land policy. It was continuous with it. The Bureau of American Ethnology operated within the same federal apparatus as the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the allotment era, drawing from the same appropriations logic and producing findings that served the same political direction. Same era, same institutions, same funding mechanisms, same directional conclusions. Follow the land at Delavan itself, and the picture becomes even more specific. Walworth County, Wisconsin, in the years surrounding 1912, was not a forgotten backwater. The lake had been attracting resort development since the late 19th century, with rail service making it accessible to money moving up from Chicago. By 1912, property around the lake was part of an actively developing leisure economy, and the presence of legally ambiguous heritage sites carried practical consequences for the kind of clean title that attracted sustained investment. Mound sites occupied an uncertain legal position. Their cultural and historical significance was acknowledged in vague terms, but the mechanism for protecting them was weak and depended heavily on whether any institution with authority chose to press the case. Once the Smithsonian classified a site, collected its material, and produced no finding of anomalous or exceptional significance, the site lost whatever protective ambiguity it had carried. The land became ordinary, the title became clean, the resort could be built. This is the beneficiary chain that the official story leaves entirely out of frame. Federal institution classifies and removes. Local land loses its ambiguity. Speculators move. Development proceeds. The original landscape, which had been a structured record of a civilization's long occupation of a place, becomes a shoreline of summer cottages and boat launches and the comfortable architecture of Midwestern leisure. It happened at Delavan. It happened at dozens of Wisconsin mound sites between 1890 and 1920. The mound density that Lapham had documented in the 1850s, that extraordinary, intentional, geometrically organized landscape, was reduced systematically across those 3 decades to scattered remnants, undeveloped parcels, and archival references that most people would never find, and fewer would know how to read. Return now to the question of the remains themselves, because the official dismissal of that aspect of the story has its own architecture, and it is worth looking at directly. The accounts of unusual skeletal finds from mound sites across the Midwest were not, in their original form, confined to sensational journalism. Certain records from early European contact across the Great Lakes include accounts describing individuals of unusual stature, not oral legend, but observations set down at the time by men in the field, in journals, in correspondence, in the administrative records of fur-trading enterprises, written by men who had practical rather than spectacular reasons to record what they observed. In the late 19th century, those accounts underwent a systematic reclassification. Under the institutional authority of the Smithsonian's Anthropological Division, observations that had previously circulated as credible historical testimony were recategorized as folklore, exaggeration, or the product of the European imagination, distorted by unfamiliarity. The reclassification was thorough, it was published, it became the scientific consensus, and the physical material that might have allowed an independent assessment of whether the reclassification was accurate was by that point inside the Smithsonian's collections, inaccessible to the researchers who might have used it to press the question from the other direction. This is the design. What remained in the public record was skepticism, neatly arranged and institutionally authoritative. What remained in the institution's unreleased storage was the evidence that had originally produced the observations the institution was now classifying as unreliable. The circle was closed from the inside. The May 1912 dispatch from the New York Times exists. It is in the archive. The Smithsonian annual reports from that period, which document Wisconsin mound collections in general terms, also exist and are accessible. These are not in dispute. What is not accessible is the specific accession record for the Delavan material. What was received, what was cataloged, what classification was assigned, what analysis, if any, was performed, and where the material currently resides. Those who have attempted to trace the specific Delavan records through archival channels describe encountering incomplete documentation, items whose post-collection fate is listed, where it is listed at all, without a clear location or transfer record. An institution that cataloged artifacts from thousands of sites does not lose track of a collection by accident. Meticulous record-keeping was not merely a professional standard in this era. It was the foundation of the Smithsonian's claim to scientific authority. The gaps in the Delavan record are not the product of administrative confusion. They are the product of a decision about what this particular material was permitted to mean and who was permitted to reach that conclusion. Science does not warehouse its anomalies. Science publishes them, debates them, uses them to test and refine its models. When an institution collects material and produces no published analysis, when it shapes the public record toward skepticism while storing the underlying evidence privately, When its archival trail goes quiet precisely at the moment, the evidence would become most revealing. The question that matters is not whether any single find was what it appeared to be. The question is why the institutional response followed a pattern this specific and this consistent across this many sites over this many years. The answer has several parts. Some of them are about scientific conservatism, the natural tendency of established frameworks to resist evidence that would require their revision. Some of them are about the professional incentives of researchers who built careers inside those frameworks. But some of them, the part that involves congressional funding, the federal Indian policy apparatus, and the resort development of Walworth County, those parts are about something more structurally useful than professional conservatism. Official story was not simply a neutral scientific conclusion that happened to be incomplete. It was a conclusion whose content aligned precisely with the needs of institutions operating in the same political moment, drawing from the same funding sources, and producing legal and economic outcomes that benefited from the story's staying exactly as it was. Come back to the lakeshore. Spring of 1912. The workers stop. The remains are there, organized and multiple, inside a mound system that a careful Wisconsin scientist had already flagged as anomalous 60 years before anyone arrived with collection authority. The men look at what they have found. Someone sends word. The newspaper prints the account, specific enough that it survived, detailed enough that it could not be ignored by anyone already paying attention. The institution was paying attention. The institution arrived. The material was removed. No published analysis followed. The mounds were cleared. The land was developed. The lakeshore filled with the infrastructure of leisure, and the story that was printed in the newspaper became, within a few years, a footnote that the institution had already classified as exaggeration. What was there before the cottages was not simply a burial site. It was a record, a physical, spatial, architectural record of a civilization using a landscape with intentionality over a very long period. A record that, if allowed to remain legible, would have complicated the prehistory that the most powerful scientific institution in the country was in the process of codifying into exhibit halls that would educate the public for the next century. The mounds are gone. Most of the local newspaper accounts have thinned to near invisibility. The land around Lake Delavan carries no visible trace of what was documented there before the development crews arrived. And somewhere in the Smithsonian's collections, in a storage level that most researchers do not reach, in material labeled with Wisconsin county names and collection years from the first decade of the 20th century, there are items that have not been made available for independent review in over 100 years. The location of some of it is listed, in response to archival inquiries, as unknown. The truth they concealed was not reducible to the physical characteristics of what was found. That framing keeps the story small, keeps it in the register of the bizarre, keeps it manageable as a curiosity for people who enjoy a strange account and then move on. The truth they concealed was about the size of what those remains implied, about who was here, in what numbers, with what sophistication, for how long, and about what it would have meant for the legal, political, and economic architecture of the American 19th century if that question had been answered honestly in public. The workers stopped. The newspaper printed it. The institution arrived. And the story became what it is now. A verified dispatch from 1912 that leads, every time you follow it carefully, to a door that has been locked from the inside for over a century.